"Let me feel everything," she said, and the way she said it made the whole town go quiet. Like even the wind forgot how to move. Caleb Ward stood 10 feet away in the dust of Red Hollow, boots planted, hand resting near his belt, but not touching, watching the Apache woman tied to the weathered post, as if she were something he couldn't quite understand, because people in this town shouted, pleaded, cursed when they were cornered. But she didn't do any of that. She just stood there with her wrists bound, chin lifted slightly, eyes steady, as if whatever came next had already been accepted long before she arrived. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the boardwalk, and the crowd lingered in that uneasy silence, waiting for something to break, for someone to say the word that would turn this into what they called justice. But Caleb didn't move, not yet, because something about her didn't fit the story they'd all agreed on. Sheriff Dalton cleared his throat somewhere behind him, voice low, uncertain. "We'll deal with it in the morning." And the people nodded, some satisfied, some disappointed, boots scraping against dry earth as they drifted away, leaving only the creak of the wooden post and the faint rustle of wind through the empty street. Caleb stayed where he was, longer than he should have, studying her the way a man studies a horizon he doesn't trust, noticing the small things others missed, the way her breathing stayed even despite the rope, the way her shoulders didn't sag, the way her eyes didn't follow the crowd but stayed fixed somewhere beyond him, like she was listening to something only she could hear. "You're not afraid," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost swallowed by the evening air, and she turned her gaze to him then, slow, deliberate, and for a moment it felt like he was the one being measured. "Fear comes when you expect mercy," she replied, her voice soft but steady, carrying a weight that didn't belong to someone tied to a post in a forgotten town. And Caleb felt something tighten in his chest at the words, something he didn't have a name for. He glanced at the rope around her wrists, rough fiber biting into skin that should have been trembling by now, but wasn't. And he realized he'd seen men twice her size lose themselves over less, heard them beg, watched them crumble under the weight of waiting. But she stood there like waiting was something she had practiced her whole life. "You think this ends well for you?" he asked, not harsh, just honest, and she held his gaze without blinking. "It ends the way it's meant to," she said, then after a pause, quieter, "but not for the reason they think." And that was when Caleb noticed it, something small at her side, half hidden beneath the folds of her worn dress, a leather pouch tied with careful knots, too deliberate for someone accused of bringing harm, too important to be overlooked. And when the last of the townsfolk disappeared into their homes and the first chill of night settled over Red Hollow, Caleb made a choice he didn't fully understand yet, turning away without another word, leaving her standing there beneath the fading light, but carrying with him the echo of that sentence, the calm in her voice, and the feeling, quiet but persistent, that by morning, the truth waiting in that silence would not belong to the town, but to him. The night settled over Red Hollow like a slow breath, cool and heavy, carrying the scent of dust, leather, and something quieter beneath it all, something that made Caleb Ward pause at the threshold of his own door instead of stepping inside. He stood there for a long moment, listening, not to the town, because the town had gone silent, but to the echo of her voice that had followed him all the way down the street, calm, steady, unchanged, as if it belonged to someone who had already made peace with whatever waited on the other side of dawn. Inside, the lamp burned low, casting soft light across the rough wooden table, but Caleb did not reach for it, did not sit, did not remove his hat. He simply turned, almost without deciding, and walked back out into the dark, boots slow against the packed earth, each step quieter than the last, as if the night itself did not want to be disturbed. When he reached the center of town again, she was still there, exactly as he had left her, shoulders straight, head slightly bowed now, not in defeat, but in stillness, like someone listening to something far away, something the rest of the world had forgotten how to hear. The rope had not changed, the post had not changed, but the air around her felt different, colder, or maybe just clearer, and Caleb found himself stopping a few feet away, not too close, not too far, caught somewhere between duty and something else he did not trust yet. "You should be resting," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. because neither of them believed rest had anything to do with this night. She lifted her head slowly, eyes finding him again without surprise, without question, as if she had known he would return, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but full, like a space waiting to be filled with truth. "You came back," she said finally, her voice softer now, but no weaker. And Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, glancing briefly at the rope before meeting her gaze again. "I had questions," he answered, simple, honest, because anything else would have sounded like a lie. Her eyes shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, as if she were looking past his words into the part of him that had brought him here, and then she nodded once, a small motion that carried more weight than any argument. "Then ask," she said, and the night seemed to lean in closer. Caleb hesitated, just for a second, then reached down, fingers brushing against the leather pouch at her side. Careful, deliberate, the kind of movement that showed respect without asking permission. And when he loosened the knot and opened it, the scent rose immediately, sharp and clean, herbs he recognized from long days on the range, leaves used to ease fever, roots ground for pain. Nothing dangerous, nothing hidden, just remedies, quiet and purposeful. He stared at them longer than he should have, the pieces falling into place one by one, slow, reluctant, because they did not fit the story the town had chosen. "This is not what they think it is," he said, more to himself than to her, and she watched him without interruption, without satisfaction, as if truth did not belong to her alone, but to whoever was willing to see it. "No," she replied after a moment. "It never was." And something in her tone shifted then, not softer, but closer, like a door opening just enough to let light through. Caleb closed the pouch carefully, tying it the way he had found it, his hands slower now, more certain, and when he looked up again, the distance between them felt different, smaller, though neither of them had moved. "Why come here?" he asked, and this time the question mattered, because it was no longer about what she had done, but why she had chosen to do it. She held his gaze, steady as before, but there was something new there now, something that had not been there in the daylight, something that did not ask for trust, but offered it anyway. "Because someone had to," she said, and the wind moved softly through the empty street, carrying her words out into the dark, where the town slept, unaware that by morning, the truth, waiting in the silence, would no longer be something Caleb could walk away from. The wind shifted sometime after midnight, carrying a colder edge that slipped between buildings and pressed softly against the stillness of Red Hollow. And Caleb Ward felt it before he saw it, the way the woman's shoulders tensed just slightly, not from fear, but from memory, as if the night itself had reached out and touched something buried deep beneath her calm. He stood there a few feet away, hat low, eyes watching without staring, trying to understand how someone could remain so steady when everything around them pointed toward an ending most people would fight against. And yet she did not fight. She did not plead. She simply endured, as if endurance itself was a language she had spent a lifetime learning. "You said someone had to," Caleb spoke again, quieter now, the words shaped by something more than curiosity, something closer to responsibility, and she lifted her gaze to him once more, the faint firelight from a distant window catching in her eyes, turning them into something deeper than shadow. "There is sickness in your town," she said, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not forced. "Children first, then the elders, slow, quiet, like a thief that does not need to run." And Caleb felt a small, sharp shift inside his chest at the mention of it, because he had seen it too, heard the coughs behind closed doors, watched the doctor shake his head more often than not, but no one had spoken of it out loud, not like this, not as something that could be faced. "You came here for that," he said, more certain now, and she nodded once, the movement barely visible, but enough. "Your people would not come to us," she continued, her voice steady as the horizon. "So I came to you." And there was no accusation in it, no edge, just truth laid plain between them like the ground beneath their feet. Caleb exhaled slowly, glancing toward the empty street where hours ago men had stood so sure of themselves, so certain of what they believed they saw, and he wondered how many of them had ever stopped long enough to look closer, to question the shape of their own judgments. "They think you brought it," he said, not defending them, just stating what was. And she did not react the way most would. No anger, no frustration, only a small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, something like sadness passing through without stopping. People fear what they do not understand, she replied. And fear makes simple stories. And Caleb felt the weight of that settle in the space between them, heavier than the rope, heavier than the post, heavier than the silence that had followed her since sunset. He stepped a little closer then, not enough to close the distance, but enough that he could see the faint lines on her hands, the marks of work, of travel, of time spent surviving rather than waiting. And he realized she was not much older than him, though something in her carried years he could not measure. "If I untie you," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "they will say I chose sides." And for the first time, something changed in her gaze, not doubt, not fear, but something softer, something that did not belong to the woman who had stood unshaken all evening. "You already have," she answered, and the truth of it landed quiet and undeniable, because standing here, listening, questioning, that alone had already set him apart from the rest. The wind moved again, brushing past them both, and Caleb looked down at the rope once more, then back at her, and in that moment he understood that this was not about choosing her over the town, or the town over her. It was about choosing what he could live with when the sun came up. "You said you wanted to feel everything," he murmured, almost to himself, and she nodded, her voice softer now than it had been all night. "Even this," she said, and Caleb realized she was not talking about pain anymore. She was talking about trust, about the risk of believing that someone might do the right thing without being forced. And that was when he reached forward, not with hesitation, but with intention, fingers brushing against the knot at her wrists as the first hint of dawn waited somewhere beyond the hills, unseen but coming all the same. The rope did not fall away all at once. It loosened slowly beneath Caleb Ward's hands, fiber by fiber, like something that had held more than just her wrists in place. And when the final knot gave, he did not step back, did not rush. He simply let the silence settle between them as she lowered her arms with care, as if even freedom required respect. She did not thank him, and he did not expect her to, because whatever passed between them in that moment was not something words could carry. It was something quieter, something that stayed in the way she flexed her fingers once, testing the return of feeling, and in the way Caleb kept his hands at his sides, not reaching, not guiding, just present. The sky behind the hills had begun to pale, a faint gray stretching into blue, and with it came the distant sounds of a town waking up, a door creaking open, boots on wood, voices low and uncertain. And Caleb knew the time they had was thinning with every breath. "They will come soon," he said, not as a warning, but as a fact, and she nodded, her gaze already shifting toward the edge of town where the first light would break. "Then we do not wait," she replied, her voice steady, but different now, carrying something new, something that had not been there before. He untied her, something like trust, fragile but real. Caleb hesitated for just a moment, not because he doubted her, but because he understood what stepping forward meant now, not for her, but for him. And then he moved, not toward the open road, but toward the narrow path between buildings that led to the small clinic at the far end of Red Hollow, the place most people avoided unless they had no other choice. She followed without question, her steps quiet despite the long night, her presence behind him not a burden, but a weight he had already chosen to carry. The clinic door stood slightly ajar, the same way it had been left the night before, and inside, the air held that familiar scent of illness and effort, of someone trying to hold a line that was slowly giving way. Caleb paused at the threshold, glancing back once, meeting her eyes, and for the first time since he had found her, he saw something there that resembled uncertainty, not fear, but the kind that comes when hope is placed into another person's hands. "If this does not work," he began, but she shook her head before he could finish, a small motion, but enough. "It must," she said, not with force, but with belief, and Caleb realized then that she was not asking for a chance, she was offering one. Inside, the room was dim, a single lantern burning low near a narrow bed where a child lay wrapped in blankets too heavy for the season, breathing shallow, uneven, and the sight of it settled something deep inside Caleb, something that pushed aside the last of his hesitation. "Show me," he said quietly, stepping aside as she moved forward, her hands steady now as she opened the pouch once more, laying out the herbs with care, each piece placed with intention, like steps in a path she had walked many times before. Outside, the town was waking, voices growing louder, footsteps gathering. And Caleb knew it would not be long before they realized what he had done, before they came looking, but for now, in that small room filled with quiet effort and fragile hope, none of that mattered, because for the first time since this began, the story was no longer being written by fear, but by something else entirely. Something softer, something that did not need to shout to be heard. And as the first light of morning touched the window, Caleb understood that whatever came next, he would not step back from it again. The child's breathing filled the small room in uneven waves, each rise and fall just a little too shallow, just a little too slow, and Caleb Ward stood near the door with his back straight, listening as if the sound itself carried answers he had not yet learned how to hear. Ayanna moved beside the narrow bed with quiet precision, her hands steady, her focus unbroken, as she crushed dried leaves between her fingers and mixed them with water from a worn tin cup, the scent rising sharp and clean into the dim air, pushing back against the heaviness that had settled there for days. She did not rush, did not speak, each motion deliberate, practiced, like something passed down through generations that never needed to be explained, only trusted. Caleb watched her work, noticing the small details others might miss, the way she checked the child's pulse with 2 fingers, the way she adjusted the blanket not just for warmth but for comfort. The way her presence alone seemed to quiet something in the room that had nothing to do with illness. Outside, the town was no longer silent. Voices had gathered, low at first, then sharper, the rhythm of boots against wood and dirt growing closer, and Caleb knew it would not be long before the door opened, before questions were asked that would not wait for answers. "They are coming," he said, not moving from his place, his voice calm but certain, and Ayanna did not look up, did not pause. She simply nodded once as she lifted the cup to the child's lips, guiding carefully, patiently, allowing time for each small swallow, as if time itself could be stretched if handled gently enough. "Then let them come," she replied, her voice softer than before, but stronger in a way that did not need volume. And Caleb felt that same quiet shift inside him again, the one that had started in the dark and had not left him since. The child stirred slightly, a faint movement beneath the blankets, and Caleb saw it, that small change, that almost invisible sign that something was working, something real, and it settled into him deeper than any argument could. The sound of footsteps reached the porch then, closer now, more certain, and a shadow crossed the thin line of light beneath the door, followed by the firm knock that carried more demand than patience. Caleb did not turn immediately, his eyes still on the scene before him. On the way, Ayanna remained steady, unshaken, even as the world outside pressed closer. "Open up, Ward," a voice called. Sheriff Dalton's, tight with urgency, and something else, something that had not been there the night before. Caleb exhaled slowly, then stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the handle for a brief moment, not hesitating, but acknowledging the line he was about to cross. When he opened it, the morning light spilled in, pale and cool, revealing a small group gathered behind the sheriff, faces drawn, eyes searching, not for confrontation, but for something they could not yet name. "You took her," one of them said, not accusing, not entirely, more uncertain than sure, and Caleb met their gaze without stepping aside, without raising his voice, just standing there, solid, present. "She is helping," he said, simple, direct, the words carrying no weight of defense, only truth, and for a moment the group did not move, did not argue. The certainty they had carried the night before no longer fitting as easily in the light of morning. Behind him, the room remained quiet except for the slow, steady sound of the child's breathing, and Ayanna did not turn to face them, did not explain. She continued her work as if the outcome did not depend on belief, but on action. The sheriff shifted slightly, his eyes moving past Caleb into the room, taking in what was there, the herbs, the careful hands, the child who now breathed a little easier than before, and something in his expression changed, not fully, not yet, but enough to loosen the grip of what he thought he knew. Caleb stepped aside. Just enough then, not as surrender, but as invitation, allowing them to see without being told, to witness without being convinced, and in that quiet space between doubt and understanding, something began to shift, slow but certain, like the first light of day pushing back the last of the night. The room did not change all at once. It shifted in small, almost invisible ways, like a breath held too long finally being released, and Caleb Ward felt it before anyone said a word, in the way the men behind him stopped speaking, in the way their boots no longer pressed forward but held still at the threshold, as if something inside that narrow space had quietly asked them to wait. Sheriff Dalton stepped in first, slow, careful, his eyes moving from Caleb to the bed, to Ayanna, to the child, whose breathing now carried a steadier rhythm than it had the night before, and though he said nothing, the tightness in his shoulders eased just enough to be noticed. The others followed without being told, hats in their hands, voices lowered, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect, though none of them would have called it that yet. Ayanna did not acknowledge them, not directly. Her focus still anchored on the child as she adjusted the cloth at the child's forehead, her fingers gentle, precise, as if each movement held weight beyond what the eye could see. Caleb remained near the door, neither stepping forward nor retreating, simply holding the space, aware that whatever happened next would not come from words alone, but from what these men chose to understand. "It is easing," Dalton said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual, as if speaking too loudly might undo what he was seeing. And Ayanna inclined her head slightly, not as agreement, but as recognition. "It will take time," she replied, her tone even, carrying no urgency, only certainty. "But the body remembers how to heal when it is given the chance." And Caleb watched the way the words settled over the room, not as explanation, but as something closer to permission. One of the men near the back shifted, glancing at the pouch laid open on the table, the herbs arranged with care, and he stepped a little closer, hesitant, as if approaching something sacred without knowing the proper way to do so. "That is what you brought," he said, not quite a question, and Ayanna finally looked up, her gaze moving across the room, meeting each of theirs without challenge, without apology. "Yes," she answered, simple, and the truth of it carried more weight than any defense. Caleb saw it then, the moment something inside them began to loosen, not completely, not all at once, but enough that the certainty they had held the night before no longer fit the shape of what they were witnessing. Dalton drew a slow breath, his eyes lingering on the child, then shifting back to Ayanna, and when he spoke again, the edge in his voice had softened into something else, something that had not been there before. "You could have walked away," he said, and she held his gaze without hesitation. "So could you," she replied, and the words did not accuse. They reflected, and in that reflection, something quiet passed between them, something that did not need to be named. Caleb glanced toward the window then, where the morning light had grown stronger, spilling across the wooden floor, touching the edge of the bed, the table, the hands that worked without pause, and he realized how much had changed between night and day without a single shot fired, without a single voice raised. Outside, the town continued to wake, unaware that inside this small room, the story they had believed in had already begun to shift, reshaped not by force, but by something far less visible, something that required more from a man than drawing a line in the dust. Dalton stepped back slightly, giving space where before there had been none, and the others followed his lead, their silence no longer heavy, but thoughtful, as if each of them was carrying away something they had not expected to find. Caleb remained where he was, watching as Ayanna returned her full attention to the child, her hands steady, her presence unchanged, and he understood then that what she had asked for in the beginning had not been about pain at all. It had been about truth, about allowing something real to be felt without turning away, and as the room settled into that quiet rhythm once more, Caleb felt it settle in him too. That same steady certainty, that whatever came next would not be decided by the town alone, but by those willing to stand in that space between what they had been taught and what they had just seen, and choose differently. The town did not return to what it had been, Not after that morning. Not after what they had seen with their own eyes. And Caleb Ward noticed it in the small things first. In the way men spoke a little quieter when they passed the clinic. In the way no one stood too close to the doorway. As if something inside had claimed a kind of space that could not be crowded. The child slept now, deeper than before, breath steady. The tension that once filled the room replaced by a calm that felt earned, rather than given. And Ayanna remained seated beside the bed, her posture relaxed but not careless, her attention still anchored, as if healing did not end when the symptoms eased, but continued in the silence that followed. Caleb leaned against the far wall, arms loose at his sides, watching the rhythm of it all, the quiet exchange between effort and patience, and he realized how little of this could be rushed, how much of it required simply staying. Sheriff Dalton had not left, though he stood further back now, hat in his hands, turning it slowly as if the motion helped him think, his eyes moving between Ayanna and the child. And then, after a long pause, he spoke, not to challenge, not to command, but to understand. "You learned this from your people," he said, and she glanced at him briefly, then nodded once, her expression unchanged. "From those who came before me," she answered. And there was something in the way she said it that carried more than instruction, something like memory, like respect for hands that had done this work long before hers. One of the men near the doorway shifted his weight, clearing his throat, hesitant but unable to remain silent any longer. "Why come alone?" he asked. "Why not bring others?" And Caleb felt the question settle in the room, not sharp, but sincere, and Ayanna met it without hesitation. "Because one is enough to begin," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to quiet something deeper than doubt, because it did not argue, it did not persuade. It simply existed as truth. Caleb pushed himself off the wall then, stepping closer, not into the center, but nearer than before, his presence no longer just observation, but participation, and he looked at Dalton, not as a man asking permission, but as one stating what had already been decided. "She stays," he said, the same words as before, but different now, heavier, grounded in what had been seen, and Dalton did not answer right away, his gaze drifting once more to the child, to the steady rise and fall of breath, to the quiet work that had brought it there. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the resistance it once had. "She stays," he repeated, not as agreement alone, but as acknowledgement, and the men behind him did not object, did not question. They simply accepted, each in their own way, that something had shifted beyond argument. Ayanna did not react to the words, not outwardly. She did not thank them, did not claim victory. She only returned her focus to the child, adjusting the blanket slightly, her movements unchanged by the decision, as if her purpose had never depended on their approval. Caleb watched her then, longer than he intended, noticing the quiet strength in her stillness, the way she did not carry herself like someone who had been right, but like someone who had simply done what needed to be done, and it settled into him in a way that words could not reach. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting light across the town, touching every roof, every road, every face that would carry this moment forward, and Caleb knew that. Red Hollow would speak of this day for years, though they might never agree on the details, might never say it the same way twice. But somewhere in those stories, beneath the dust and distance, there would remain a quieter truth, one that did not need to be told loudly, because it had already been felt, in the steady breath of a child, in the silence of a room, and in the choice of a man who had decided, without needing to say it twice, where he would stand. By midday, the air inside the clinic had changed in a way no one could quite explain, not lighter, not warmer, but clearer, as if something unseen had stepped aside and allowed the room to breathe again. And Caleb Ward noticed how people entered now, not in groups, not with voices raised, but one at a time, hats in hand, footsteps slower, eyes searching not for proof, but for understanding. Ayanna remained where she had been since morning, beside the bed, though her work had shifted from urgency to watchfulness, her hands now resting in her lap between small, precise adjustments, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but quietly held it. The child stirred more often now, not in distress, but in the restless way of someone returning from far away, and each time, Ayanna would lean forward just enough, checking, listening, guiding without forcing, as if she trusted the body to find its own way back if given the right path. Caleb had stepped outside for a time, leaning against the wooden railing that ran along the front of the clinic, watching the town move under the rising sun, noticing how conversations shifted when he passed, not stopping, but softening, as if something in the air had made certainty harder to hold on to. Sheriff Dalton joined him after a while, standing beside him without speaking at first, both men looking out over the same street that had felt so different just hours before. "I have seen sickness before," Dalton said eventually, his voice low, measured, "but I have not seen it turn like that." And Caleb nodded once, not because he had an answer, but because he understood the weight of what the man was trying to say. "You think it is her doing?" Caleb replied, not asking, and Dalton considered it, his gaze steady on the horizon. "I think she knew what we did not," he said after a moment, and there was no shame in it, only recognition, and Caleb felt that same quiet shift again, the one that had begun in the dark and had not left him since. Inside, a soft voice called his name, not urgent, but enough to draw him back, and when he stepped through the doorway, he saw the child sitting up slightly, supported by folded blankets, eyes half open, not fully awake, but no longer lost, and the sight of it settled something deep in his chest, something that did not need words. Ayanna glanced toward him briefly, then back to the child, offering a small sip of water, her movements unchanged, her focus unwavering, and Caleb realized that for her, this moment was not an ending, but a continuation of something she had always known. One of the women from town stepped forward then, hesitant, holding a cloth in her hands, and after a brief pause, she extended it toward Ayanna, not as payment, not as obligation, but as an offering, and Ayanna accepted it with a slight nod, nothing more. No exchange of gratitude, just a quiet understanding passing between them. Caleb watched that moment closely, recognizing it for what it was, not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day become it. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting longer light across the doorway, and the town continued its slow adjustment, each person carrying away their own version of what had happened, their own piece of a story that no longer fit into the shape it had the night before. Dalton stood in the doorway now, no longer at a distance, his presence less rigid, more open, and when he looked at Caleb, there was something different in his expression, something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Caleb met that look, then turned back toward the room, toward Ayanna, toward the quiet work that had shifted everything without asking permission, and he understood then that what mattered was not whether the town would remember this correctly, but whether they would remember it at all, because some truths did not need to be agreed upon to remain real. They only needed to be witnessed, and once seen, they had a way of staying, even in places that had never made room for them before. By late afternoon, the light over Red Hollow had softened into something warmer, stretching long across the street and slipping quietly through the open doorway of the clinic, and Caleb Ward stood just outside, one hand resting against the wooden frame, watching the slow rhythm of a town that no longer moved the same way it had the day before. Inside, the child now sat upright without support, color returning to their face, eyes clearer, and though no one spoke it aloud, everyone who stepped into that room carried the same quiet understanding that something had been given back that could not be measured in coin or words. Ayanna moved less now, her work no longer urgent, her presence settling into stillness, as if she had stepped out of the center of the story the moment it no longer needed her there. And Caleb noticed how she did not linger near the door, did not look to the others for acknowledgement. She simply remained until there was nothing left to do. Sheriff Dalton had returned more than once, each time standing a little closer, speaking a little less, until even his silence felt different, no longer guarded, but reflective, like a man who had found himself standing on unfamiliar ground and chosen not to step away. As the sun dipped lower, the people of the town began to drift back to their routines, but slower, quieter, carrying something with them they had not brought into the morning, and Caleb could see it in the way they glanced toward the clinic, not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect, though none of them would have named it that. When Ayanna finally rose from the chair beside the bed, it was without announcement, without ceremony. She simply gathered the few items she had laid out, tying the pouch with the same care she had shown in every other movement. And Caleb felt that shift before he understood it, the subtle closing of a moment that had never asked to be held. He stepped inside then, not to stop her, not to question, but because something in him knew this was the part that mattered most, the part where nothing more would be said than what needed to be. She turned slightly as he approached, their eyes meeting in that quiet space where everything that had happened stood between them, unspoken but understood. "You are leaving," he said, not as a question, and she inclined her head just enough to answer. "There are others who will need this," she replied, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning, and Caleb nodded once, because he understood that her purpose had never been tied to this place, only to what needed to be done within it. For a moment, neither of them moved, the room holding its breath around them, and then Caleb reached to the side, lifting a worn blanket from the back of a chair, the same one he had used during long nights on the range, and he held it out to her without a word. She looked at it, then at him, and for the first time since he had met her, something in her expression softened in a way that did not come from endurance, but from being seen. She accepted it quietly, wrapping it around her shoulders, and though their hands did not linger, the gesture itself carried more than any promise could. Outside, the evening settled over Red Hollow, the sky turning shades of amber and blue, and Ayanna stepped past him, moving toward the open road without hesitation, without looking back, because some journeys did not require witness. Caleb remained where he was, watching until her figure blended into the distance, until the dust and light erased the line between where she ended and the horizon began, and only then did he turn, stepping back into the town that felt both familiar and changed. Behind him, the child laughed softly, a sound that had not been heard in days, and it carried through the quiet street like something new, something earned, and Caleb paused for just a second, letting that sound settle into him, before moving on, knowing that out here, justice did not always arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the choice to stay, in the choice to listen, and in the choice to let something real be felt, even when